This year, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, inflation has reached 8.5%, its highest rate since 1982. Today, we've gathered local experts to speak on the current financial state of both our nation and our local community and the ways inflation has impacted all of us. Here to speak from the St. Louis Federal Reserve is Charles Chuck Gascon. Today, Chuck will be speaking with us about what creates an inflationary environment and what occurs economically on a national level as a result of its impact. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
Well, for our viewers, can you give us a basic one-on-one on exactly what inflation is and what kind of precursors set us up for this point of what we're experiencing right now?
Absolutely. So inflation is the overall increase in the price level of a broad base of goods and services that people consume. So it's not the price in the dollar amounts that we look at, but it's actually the change in prices over time. Typically, we measure it on a year-over-year basis. So how much have prices increased from one year to the next? And it's driven by the factors of supply and demand. So when households have more money to spend, they'll demand more goods and services, and that can generate increases in prices. And then on the supply side, if firms are facing higher costs and they feel like they can pass those on to consumers, they may do so, and that can also generate higher consumer prices. So those are the kind of factors that'll generate these changes in prices. Ultimately, when we think about inflation slowing down, that doesn't necessarily mean that prices will fall broad-based, but rather prices will stop growing at the rate in which they've been growing in the recent years.
So we've heard a lot about supply and demand and COVID disruption, the pandemic, the workforce disruption now that we don't have as many people in the workforce. So do you feel like that we're still feeling those effects, both of the pandemic and the workforce, or now has it shifted to a different cause?
Yeah, so overall employment is about 800,000 workers short of where it was before the pandemic. You know, in aggregate terms, that's pretty close to overall employment prior to the pandemic. But there still are people that are on the sidelines and looking for work or have dropped out of labor force due to early retirement and factors like that. So those pandemic factors are still there. We also just had a wave of lockdowns in China. So those were related to the pandemic and much more recent. Those disrupted global supply chains again. And then you add into that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, just disrupting global supply chains and oil markets in particular. So those factors are still adding to inflationary pressures. Professional forecasters expect that those supply chain disruptions will add to inflation at least through the end of this year. But there is a lot of uncertainty on that outlook still.
So now that we're 2 years into the pandemic, can you explain these pressures on the supply chain? Many people have already gone back to work. We've only seen lockdowns in a few other countries. So why this far into the pandemic are we still kind of slowly coming out of these problems with supply chain?
Absolutely. So over the last 30 years, maybe even longer than that. I mean, if you go through history, it's been about trying to become more efficient in how we produce goods and services. And that's led to keeping lower inventories in warehouses and at retailers. And as a result of that, when we have disruptions, it's made the economy much more susceptible to those kind of shocks, be it a storm or, the closure of a plant due to a breakout of some type of disease. And that has a ripple effects through the entire economy. It makes the news, and then consumers panic and actually can sometimes make it worse. So it's a trade-off. We want to be efficient and keep prices as low as possible, but the cost is sometimes we can be more susceptible to shocks because we have less on hand to kind of buffer.
All right. everybody. So another hot topic, of course, gas prices, the increase in gas prices. And the president, I guess, is considering lifting the national gas tax for a day. What types of government intervention can be done, number one, and what types of those interventions can truly make a difference in helping stabilize these issues?
Yeah, so overall, I mean, if you think about gasoline prices, they're probably one of the most notable. They're posted on billboards on pretty much every street corner around the country. So people pay a lot of attention to what the price of gasoline is. It's also a good that you have to buy to get to and from work and get your families around. So as gasoline prices increase, it erodes consumers' ability to buy other goods and services. So we're at the holiday, season coming up here with the 4th of July, and people travel. If they have to spend more money on gas in their car, it may mean that they can spend less money on other services and recreational amenities. So when those prices go up, people feel it in a lot of ways. That being said, inflation is really broad-based across many consumer products. Housing is another one that's out there that we've seen rents increase pretty significantly. These are the kind of things that ultimately it just involves, trying to resolve some of the supply chain issues and pushing down costs of raw materials, but then also tempering demand and getting the economy to grow at a much more sustainable pace. U.S. economic growth was around 5% last year. That's about double what kind of economists estimate the long-run sustainable growth rate of the economy is. So we need to get to a more steady, long-term sustainable path for growth. And that involves raising interest rates and getting the economy to that steady state level of growth again.
So when we saw this kind of mass exodus of workers around the COVID-19 pandemic and slowly getting back into the workforce, that also seemed to create some pressure on wages and what people are paid. Is that contributing to inflation as well? And will we continue to see that as people, again, reassess and start to get back into the workforce and what they're willing to work for in terms of wages?
Yeah, so workers' wages in many cases are determined by their expectations of how prices are going to be increasing in the future. So keeping inflation expectations and anchored around the kind of more modest 2 to 3% levels is really important for workers to be able to feel confident in that the raises that they're getting are going to keep up with cost of living. And that's why on a central bank standpoint, it's really important that we get inflation expectations to a level that's sustainable long term and get inflation to a level that's sustainable so workers can feel like wages in the 3 to 4% range are going to improve their standards of living and keep up with rising costs. So getting inflation down and getting those expectations that inflation will come down is really important to moving that forward. Beyond that, we are seeing retirees come and re-enter the labor force as they're seeing good job prospects out there. Unfortunately, we've also seen the stock market retrace many of its gains from last year, so that's also had some wealth effects and pushing people back into the labor force. But it's welcome, as there are a lot of shortages in some key sectors such as childcare and in the hospitality sectors.
So are there certain industries that tend to be hardest hit by inflation, and how long does it take for those types of industries to recover from something like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it depends on the driver of inflation, of these price increases. So if it's driven by demand, take travel right now, or the reopening of the economy and people traveling for the pandemic, firms may find that they're faced with higher costs and they're able to pass those costs onto their customers, and customers are willing to pay them because they really want to enjoy these amenities. In those cases, it's not necessarily going to have a negative effect on firms, and they're going to be able to operate. But there are other sectors, take like the public sector and schools, for example, where wages may be fixed, budgets may be fixed, and they're facing higher costs. And now they're going to have to try to figure out how to do, the same amount with fewer resources facing those higher costs. The healthcare sector would be another great example of a sector that's now facing higher input costs, but their prices are negotiated on a couple of year basis. So they're not able to necessarily recoup all those expenses. So hospitals, for example, are really feeling the pinch right now from what we're hearing from many industry contacts.
So can you explain for our viewers the correlation and relationship between inflation and interest rates? We've heard a lot about the Fed's potentially and deciding to increase interest rates. Explain those types of things, that the relationship between that and what that will entail.
Yeah, ultimately, most contemporary economic models kind of describe inflation dynamics as coming from consumers and businesses' expectations of what inflation will be in the future. And so when we see inflation expectations rise, that it can sometimes be a self-fulfilling prophecy of higher inflation in the future. The role of the central bank ultimately is to keep its credibility in that it can keep inflation in check and sustainable at that 2% target in the long term. In this environment, what that means is raising interest rates up to a level where we can get sustainable growth, like I said, more in the 2% range, and ultimately get inflation to come down to that level as well. So this is as much a signaling issue as it is a practical issue of getting inflation and inflation expectations back down to a sustainable path.
So are there any lessons that we learned from the last recession that can help us through, avoiding another one, and can help us now with this record inflation right now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned when we go back to, for example, 2008 and 2009 and the subsequent recovery. One of which is that the traditional relationship between labor markets and the Phillips curve is often noted, and that you have to have the unemployment rate rise substantially to pull inflation back down. We've seen that relationship has fallen apart over time, and with job demand, workers or firms demanding workers at the rate that they are. Also demographic factors pulling down the labor supply. I think that there are a lot of ways that we can kind of pull inflation back down without seeing significant rises in the increases in the unemployment rate, because the pool of workers is just smaller, and workers are going to be able to find jobs at a higher rate. So I think that's one thing that we've taken away, is this trade-off that used to be quite strong in the 1970s and 80s between inflation and the unemployment rate has really broken down. And hopefully that allows us to bring inflation back into more sustainable levels without having to slow the economy significantly. But there are a lot of risks to that and many challenges to come.
So do you feel like with the effects of the pandemic and also now inflation, that the middle class is now shrinking, that we're seeing more people fall off into struggling working families, and then the upper class, there's more of a chasm now with these types of pressures on the workforce?
I think what we've seen as a result of the pandemic is actually lower wage workers have seen pretty substantial upticks in their wages due to just the demand for those jobs. So we have seen like the lowest 25% of wage earners see pretty strong increases in their wages in the last couple of years. So that's been a really bright spot in this recovery that we didn't see in the last recovery. So that is a positive aspect of what we've seen in recent years.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your information. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Now we're joined by USI Professor of Economics, Dr. Kathy Carey. Today, Kathy will be speaking with us about inflation's economic impact on the local community. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's go back a little bit to Economics 101. We just touched on that a little bit, but it's really kind of a conundrum because capitalism is really based on people spending and having a thriving economy, and you want people spending their money, making money, and growing small business and things like that. But that can also be coupled with other issues that create inflation. Can you kind of explain that for us a little bit?
Okay. Well, if individuals are spending, unemployment is low, people have jobs, the economy is doing well, it has done very well. COVID surprised us because we automatically assumed the economy was going to go into a deep depression right away, but the federal government enacted policies and And we found out that people actually can spend when they're sitting at home online,
Right.
and a lot of production still continued. So the economy wasn't hit as hard as we thought it would be. But we did have some federal impact checks that were sent out, about 3 rounds of them, and people had money to spend. They reduced they increased their savings. They paid down their credit cards. They changed the things that they purchased because they were at home.
Right.
You know, so those things contribute to inflation if the supply can't keep up with it. And so we had a lot of situations where individuals couldn't be at work and they couldn't be producing, and firms keep very low inventory levels, and as a result, those were purchased, and then there wasn't a way to replenish that right away. You know, so inflation is occurring from 2 different angles. One is the spending angle, and the other is the supply side angle, the supply chain issues, the labor issues that we're seeing now as a result.
So whenever we think about local impacts that we see with inflation, we see national impacts in terms of gas prices and things like that. So what do you feel like we are seeing locally whenever it comes to the impact of inflation on our community?
Well, locally, the impact is pretty much the same as it is nationally. I mean, we're going to the store, we're spending our hard-earned income, and it's not going as far. We're not able to buy as many things, or our bill we walk out with is much higher. You know, so locally it's impacting individuals that way. And when they go to buy gas, they find their gas prices a lot higher, and that affects them going to work. It affects them going to the grocery store. It affects them going out and doing the things that they like to do. So locally as well as nationally, we're all feeling the pressure of higher prices given our current incomes.
Well, when we talk about government intervention, we always talk about the feds raising interest rates. From your perspective, what do you feel like are other types of interventions or things that the government can do or local government can do in order to help mitigate this issue?
In my opinion, there's not a whole lot the local government can do in this situation because it is a national event. And but from a national level, the Fed is absolutely doing the right thing by raising interest rates to reduce spending. And that is one thing that it's not something that we as individuals enjoy, because that means it's going to be more expensive to buy a home, to buy a car, to buy all those things that you would borrow to buy. But it would, you know, kind of reduce that pressure for firms to be able to catch up on the inventory. So there is that. And that will help counteract the demand pull inflation. But then we've got the cost push inflation, and the cost push inflation comes from the supply side. Labor costs are rising.
Right.
You know, individuals, they had some time where they had some good income. Some of them have been off. They're coming back to work, and they're asking for higher pay, and they have the right to do that because, you know, the labor market is so tight right now. So we see costs going up on the labor side. We see costs going up on the energy side, and we see the supply chain issues in other countries are impacting us, or production issues. When China has shutdowns, that impacts us because we buy a lot of component parts and final goods from China, and it's difficult for those products to get to us. So those, and then again, on a policy standpoint, on that side, you pretty much have to work out the problem. And part of the problem with the oil and gas is the reduced production and the increased demand. You know, so they need to figure out what to do on oil and gas.
So we hear a little bit about a gas tax holiday, about suspending the gas tax, those types of things. And those are temporary measures. Do you feel like they really make a dent in the problem, or is it just truly very little temporary relief?
Well, I'm an economist. And no, I don't. I think it's very temporary, and I don't even think you'll get the full impact of it. If we reduce the federal gas tax, that's what, 18 cents. It will not all go to the consumer. Some of it will go to the gas stations. And then if the states follow, then they've reduced it the price of gasoline maybe 40, 50 cents, but it's only for a certain amount of time. And then when that time period ends, we still haven't dealt with the actual issue that's causing the prices to rise.
Right.
And so when the time ends, then those prices will return.
It sounds like the magic formula is reducing demand and increasing supply. But we've also heard the Governor Holcomb, talk about potentially returning back to taxpayers $225 per person. Is that just yet another influx of money into the economy that will spur more demand, or do you feel that like that's another viable relief option?
Well, it's not an influx of money because only the Fed can create money, but it is a redistribution of funds. And as far as will it solve the problem, as my opinion as an economist, it will not, because the initial problem is still there.
Right.
There's not enough oil and gas for the demand to meet the demand right now.
All right. So also whenever we look at, now that we've got the prices that have raised, we've got the inflation, once that stabilizes, will we ever see those prices come back down, or is that the new level? What happens to pricing once inflation stabilizes? You very rarely see a reduction, right?
Prices do fall on occasion. I mean, the price level, it has happened actually in recent years, so prices do fall. But it's more likely what you're going to see is the prices will stop rising and they'll just rise at a slower rate. There are industries where prices will come down. There is a reason that the Fed looks at what's called core inflation, which is the CPI less food and energy. And that's because food and energy prices tend to fluctuate a lot. And as they fluctuate, it is possible that gas prices could go back down to $2. It's not likely, but it is possible. Food prices also can fluctuate up and down. I mean, they're relying on the weather. They're relying on fertilizer costs, which right now is a global issue. They're relying on a lot of things that can reverse themselves. So it is possible that some of your food and energy costs might come down, but as far as a lot of the other items, they'll probably just rise at a slower rate.
Okay. Well, explain to us what happens with people's investments in retirement funds in this type of environment. And is there anything that individuals can do to kind of protect their assets while we're in this situation?
Not really. Okay. The time to protect your income is before the inflation starts. You want to have your investments. And I'm not a financial advisor, so I don't want to say anything that's going to make anyone run out and change what they do. But you want to try to invest your money in a way that earns a return that's higher than inflation. And that's hard to find right now because the stock market is declining and interest rates are incredibly low. Real estate markets, that's starting to turn. It's very possible. So a lot of the traditional avenues to protect yourself aren't there right at this moment. It doesn't mean don't buy stocks, because stocks, you hear a lot about stocks are on sale. So you want to do that unless you're close to retirement, because if you're close to retirement, then you want to have your money in a source that doesn't fluctuate as much.
Right. Yes.
However, the inflation is going to eat away the value of those funds. So people that are on fixed incomes or low incomes are going to suffer a little bit more than.
So from an economist perspective, how long are we going to be in this, and how do we see ourselves get out?
Let me pull out my magic crystal ball. From an economist's perspective, it depends.
Right.
It depends on a lot of things, on how fast the economy responds to the higher interest rates. It depends on, global issues such as the market price for oil and gas and production supply. It depends on regulations. And there are so many things that can impact it that it makes it very difficult to forecast. I know it's something that I do. But I do believe that we're doing many of the right things that should help ease it, but there's going to probably be a little pain to come with it.
Sure. just like other things, very complex issue, far more than meets the eye, right, whenever it comes to something like this. Well, Kathy, thank you so much for your information. We appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thanks again to all of our guests for joining us to discuss the ways our community is dealing with inflation. Thanks for watching WNIN Newsmakers.